I hope you're ready to be taken on a journey and to be inspired by our opening keynote speaker, Dr. James Rothman. A childhood immersed in nature, studies in biology, working as a canoe guide, and head of the Outdoor and Experiential Education Unit at Queen's University, all eventually led him to his current journey as author and adventurer. James's life centers on organizing and participating in a variety of annual expeditions related to his writing and research interests. Last summer, he was part of the Connected by Canoe project, a canoe journey marking Canada's 150th, with a floating forum to connect Canadians to each other and to the natural world. Last month, he was honored by the Governor-General with a Meritorious Service Medal for his leadership at the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough. James is a prolific writer. You might know his work as an author of many best-selling books, such as Rendezvous with the Wild, Fire in the Bones, or Emperor of the North. Or you might have seen one of his contributions to National Geographic, the Globe and Mail, CBC Radio, or the Discovery Channel. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dr. James Ruffin.
Good morning, friends, Romans, Roma ends. Countrymen, I've got a snoot full of Shakespeare. We went to see King Lear last night. King Lear's a woman now. Anyway, I'm just going to start in and say thank you for the introduction, Liz. I do indeed want to take you on a journey this morning, and that journey is going to take you around Canada. I think the defining characteristic of this nation is that it is a nation of rivers, and it is also a river of nations, and I want to honor Kat Krieger and say thank you for bringing a Cayuga voice and to get us started right here. But if there is a jewel in the center of this nation with respect to its riparian heritage, it's got to be this amazing province of Ontario. And I think too often most of us get sort of caught up in the idea that the golden horseshoe is the Ontario that matters. And indeed, it probably, in some senses, in terms of industry, is the economic heart of the province. But if if this province has a community soul, it is those communities and jurisdictions that are dotted out across the province from east to west to north to south. And that's why I'm delighted to be here. I look at the province, probably, I just might as well state my bias right at the beginning. It's a province of rivers, it's a province of nations, it's a province of communities, but it's also a province of canoes. And if you don't believe me, check this out. I mean, it doesn't matter where you look, from Atikokan to Acton, from Elliott Lake to Niagara-on-the-Lake. I've studied this Elliott Lake poster, by the way. Is anybody here from Elliott Lake? No? Oh, well, I'm pretty sure they're both really happy because they're married to somebody else. That's what I've decided there. But having said that, I do want to say that what makes it possible for me to live the life I live, it is that my wife and partner of nearly 40 years, Gail Simmons, is here. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to honor her for being here and for supporting this lifestyle, which last year involved 168 days away from home, and that my key still fits the locks is a friggin' miracle. Yeah. Yeah, Long Lac to Lager, it goes on and on. From Lottos to lift locks, doesn't matter where you look in Ontario, from Lake Couchiching to couches. If you want one of those, they come from London. It's what happens when high-end furniture manufacturers and canoe builders get together and get hammered one night on Nightingale Avenue. Agawad, Algonquin, yeah, it goes on. Big ferries, the Chichiman up on to Little Ferries. Pembroke, I know I traveled on the elevator with somebody from Pembroke today to pictographs. Yeah, Matisse to Moose Factory. This is what I see. When I see people, I see the province from Harrow to Hamilton, from Haliburton to Hicksville. Yep. In fact, it is a province of canoes, and I want to just acknowledge that I'm here. It's something that I've learned from many First Nation people around here, but at this very moment, this instant, Ontario tourism people are in London, England. I just came from there, actually. They're going to be doing a photo shoot at the Abbey Road crosswalk today with canoes, portaged canoes. I have no idea what that means, but it turns out I know one of the councillors from that borough in London. And so Ontario is known for a lot of things. And you don't have to look very far. Look at this magazine in our rooms in this very hotel. When they want to say adventure, what do they use outside Roy Thompson Hall there? A red canoe, of course. But it is the hinterland that holds what I think is the essence of this province. It is the rural part of this province. It's you, it's Roma. My sister said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to talk to this Roma conference." And she said, "Will it be a band of gypsies?" And I said, "Yeah, probably." And how do I know that? Well, I grew up on the banks of the mighty Speed River in Guelph, Ontario, and that led to Boy Scouts and various things. It led to a somewhat pathological fascination with these. But that's turned into a lifetime of journeying and traveling. And I want to just tell you about the most recent journey, if you like, which happened last year. There were actually 4 major journeys that happened last year that I was participating in. But I want to tell you a little bit about Canada C3, which was an initiative to get Canadians to talk to each other by sailing an icebreaker from Toronto to Victoria. We started on the 1st of June and finished on the 30th of April. And I really would like to, in 40 minutes and 4 seconds, take you to 10 places that I traveled to this past year. And I want to introduce you to 10 people, 10 heroes, Hinterland Heroes, I would call them. And I want to say that as you are dealing with real-time crisis management that as a result of social media bringing things to the fore instantaneously, or water or sewer, or all of the important things that you're dealing with, often thankless things that you're dealing with, I want to just say to you that I hope from these 10 little stops we're going to make in the next 40 minutes that you'll find something in terms of a community that might be a little bit like yours, or that might twig something in you. So I have no answers for your sewage problems. I have no answer for, I am one of those taxpayers who wants 70 services for 2020 taxes. I mean, on it goes. But I am here to tell you that I think what you're doing, I don't think there is a more important job in this nation than the people who run the little communities who are this nation, and that's you, that's us. So first stop, give yourselves a hand, absolutely. So we left Toronto, we stopped at Ganawage, and the hero there is this attitudinous Mohawk babe called Tio Horn. It's amazing, but Tio took her, we stopped in Montreal, she took us to her home community of Ganawage, and not totally off the agenda, she decided to take us all swimming. And we didn't have swimsuits. That was a little bit of a problem, but we were getting to know each other, so on we went. She took us to a quarry that's sort of in that green part back by what was the early version of the Mercier Bridge. And the reason she took us to that quarry is that is the place where the rock was quarried to build the St. Lawrence Seaway. And she told us one very simple but very profound thing. Ganawage means the place on the river. And the river is where life comes from for the Mohawk people who live there. It's like any of us who live on a river, and most of us do. The river provides us with life, with water, with food, with spiritual sustenance as well. And what that quarry did in the 1950s was create a berm to create a shipping channel in the St. Lawrence River that effectively, if you look at it in that graphic, separates Ganawage from the river. Totally. And that was news to me. And Oka, I remember vividly in the summer of 1990, was something that Dio Horn experienced as a 4-year-old. She was amazing. She's an actress in horror movies. I find horror movies really scary, so I had no idea who she was. But one of the beauties of traveling on a ship is that next town down from Montreal was Trois-Rivières. We stopped there. We had a few bikes on board the ship. So Dio and I ended up biking around Trois-Rivières. And as it happens, cool idea, there are 3 pianos downtown Trois-Rivières that get rained on, and you just sit down and play them. And Dio and I got off our bikes and turns out she's a pretty wicked piano player. And we started talking about Oka and the conflict between the Mohawks and the others in Quebec. And she had a tremendous enmity for French people. She had a tremendous enmity for people like me. And I was able to tell her, and we talked, she said, do you remember some of those images? And I said, absolutely. I said, I was doing my PhD at the time, and it had a profound effect. I knew that I was studying the relationship between people and place, and I knew that I had to do that cross-culturally after seeing Ellen Gabriel and some of the others on. But we talked, and it just, I mean, there's a lesson right there, but she said, you remember that picture of Corporal LeMay, or whatever his name is, talking to Randy, one of the warriors, talking heck. And she said, you remember that other image that came out of that, of a teenage girl who'd been accidentally stabbed by a Canadian bayonet, and her little sister was hanging around her neck in a blue raincoat? And I said, yeah, I remember that. She said, well, that was me. That was me in the blue raincoat. And I have been carrying that image in my head since then. And what do you say to somebody like that? We have become disconnected. And so I just want to say that there is no substitute for anything you do for bringing people together to get them to talk. Dio Horn went down the river that day. For about 2 weeks she was with us, and she had an amazing effect on everybody else because we got to see and live with a Mohawk person and learn. But she also got to realize that the welcome we received from all of the little French places along the St. Lawrence River was a welcome directed at her. And she had a breakthrough, and in fact, in each of the little cabins aboard this icebreaker, there's a journal. And if you look at her 20-page, I don't know where she found the time, journal entry in the book from her cabin, it's all about how her enmity for French people has evaporated and how she needs to learn to speak French to come forward. Next stop, amazing place, Mi'alpukek, Conn River. It's the only Mi'kmaq community. And the hero here is Mizell Joe, Sagama Mizell Joe. Mi'alpukek is the only Mi'kmaq community in Newfoundland. And Mizell Joe got sick and tired of hearing that from other people that they thought the Mi'kmaq got to Newfoundland on the deck of a Basque sailing ship. And he said, no, we got here by bark canoe. And he'd never built or even seen a bark canoe in his life. But as a chief and counselor in that community, it took them 3 tries, but they built a bark canoe in Mi'alpukek and they paddled to Nova Scotia. And just to put this into some kind of perspective, if you've ever paddled from here to there in a canoe, what's it say there? 172 kilometers is the gap between Port aux Basques and St. Paul Island's in the middle. That's no small feat. But that is a metaphor for what Mizell Joe has done for his community. He's taken unemployment from double digits to single digits. He's taken high school leaving from single digits to almost 100%. He's an amazing guy. He's written a book, and I'd be happy to talk about that as he goes forward. Mizell Joe, when we got to Mi'alpukek, had actually made a canoe, and there's expedition leader Jeff Green, that we brought aboard the ship, and that canoe reminded us, with natural materials from Newfoundland, that pulling together is a good thing and that we are all on the same waterway, much of the same message that Elder Krieger gave us this morning. Traveling at high speed, it's about 230 nautical miles from St. John's to Fogo, and if you want to find hope in one body, in one person, it's in Zita Cobb. Zita Cobb is from Fogo Island. Of course, it was a cod fishing community. All of our communities, some of yours for sure, have been resource development, but the cod stock went out the window. she went out and became very, very wealthy through JDS Uniphase and some of the other things, very wealthy, and she came back to Fogo and she started making scholarships. And people in town said eventually, they said, this is a great idea, but you're just paying kids to leave this town. And so she said, right. And she created the Fogo Island Inn. She created the Shorefast Foundation. She created Fogo Island Arts. And she single-handedly, with the help of her siblings and community members, and it really just was leadership. And if you're in this room, you know what leadership is. It doesn't take a lot, but it needs commitment, it needs authenticity, it needs a whole lot of things. But I tell you, when we arrived there, we knew that, well, Zita's quick to say that at one point we were 8 funerals away from losing our punt technology. So they said, we got to learn how to build punts. So they learned how to build Fogo Island punts. We were laughing on the ship because we had a secret weapon. We had Adam Van Couverden, who got his little gold and silver Olympic doors blown off by people from Fogo who knew how to row properly. Yeah. Whew, up to Pond Inlet. This is an interesting lesson about planning for disruption, I think. PJ Akiagok is the head of the Kitikmeot Inuit Association, and we happened to be there when, it was a painful welcome, my goodness. Don't try this at home, folks. Limaki won that handily, I'll have to tell you. But Catherine McKenna was there to announce the creation of Tuluringak Imanga, which is the Lancaster Sound Marine Protected Area, and it's a huge deal from the point of view of conservation. But PJ was there, and what's he doing? After Minister McKenna stood up and announced the creation of the borders here, he just stood up with a shopping list of all the things that he felt the federal government should bring to help people understand this protected area. Airport, port, new accommodations, and it was really, really interesting turn of perspective for many of us who were there. We were thinking conservation of natural values, and that's super important. But he was thinking community building, and he is going to get his airport upgrade, he's going to get his deep water port, and as a result of that, it's a bunch of very creative negotiating. I want to now just whisk you through the Northwest Passage. That's another thing you shouldn't try at home because it's an amazing part of this nation, and it's not really about this talk. This talk is about introducing you to some amazing people and to some little communities. So Tuktoyaktuk was beyond the end of the road in North America. It's at the mouth of the Mackenzie River. Inuvik is the place about 130 km south of Tuk, where the road ends, the Dempster Highway ends. But the hero I want to introduce you to is Chiquita Charlie Grubin, who's a 22-year-old from that community. And we ended up there, and there was a great hoo-ha that was going on. Remember the Trans-Canada Trail? That has been created all this time. It's been rebranded as the Great Trail. So there's Valerie Pringle standing beside Jeff Green, our expedition leader, and Valerie is the titular head of the Great Trail. Her executive director is to her left, and that's Sandy Silver, the premier of the Yukon. Actually, on our way out of Tuktoyaktuk, I was driving a Zodiac, and there's this guy, and our ship was actually, we couldn't get closer than 20 clicks away from town because it's so shallow in the estuary of the river. And there's this guy in a black puffy jacket sitting in my Zodiac. I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm Sandy Silver, Premier of the Yukon." Oh, how do you do, Mr. Premier? I felt like an idiot. I probably was an idiot. But Cheetah Charlie Grubin lives there, and she has lived her whole life with a winter road to Inuvik, which brings in all kinds of good things, and gravel leaves there. Turns out the delta is full of gravel, but what's happening, it just happened in November, and Cheetah was totally aware of this, is the all-weather road is going into Tuktoyaktuk, and it's going to fundamentally change that community. But she's been on council since she was 18. I don't know where she gets the foresight. I don't know where she gets the courage. But to just listen to her and talk to her was like filling your heart with possibility. And I watched her. She was actually with us as we sailed around Alaska. And she would stand up, that's I think in Nome, Alaska. She's standing up talking to high school kids, a little bit younger than she is, but talking about her own community and how she's worried that that full weather road is going to change the traffic of drugs, and how her community, she thinks, is not ready for the influx of tourists that are going to come. And this is echoed around the world, but instead of it coming out of the mouth of somebody who's her parents' age or older, this is a kid who's just gone on. And there are kids like this in every community. I think they just need to find the possibility of where to go. Next stop, Tikarak, Point Hope. I've never had a hug like this that I got that day from Carolyn Cannon. Carolyn, it was another long, long Zodiac ride to get ashore to this little spit in Alaska. And Carolyn met me on the shore and hugged me so enthusiastically and genuinely. I pushed her away just to look at her face to ask if we were somehow related. And she said, no. She said, no, I just want to welcome you to our community. And she said, you know, I just won the Nobel Prize. And another moment of absolute brilliance, I said, no shit. How did I miss that? And it turns out it's not the Nobel, it's the Goldman Prize. But what is it for? This is a person who's come from the Stone Age essentially in her lifetime. It's still a huge whaling community, but it was for leading the charge to control seismic testing in the waters where they hunt for whales. And it's an amazing story. People are still hunting out of Umiaks in Tikarak. These are Inupiaq people related to the Inuit in Canada. And well, let me just take, so they welcomed us into this community. We went into the school and we had a meal, and we talked with the kids in the school. We talked with Carolyn and some of the other elders in town, but then they took us out into their world, which is on this alluvial spit sticking out into the Chukchi Sea. Now, back in the day, the Chukchi Sea, which is not mentioned in my journal, I must do a little bit better putting the place names on, but it's sort of, you see Tikarak there on the sort of sticky-outy point. That's technical language, I know, off the northwest part of Alaska, but that's the Chukchi Sea out there. That is a place that used to be frozen in the winter, but sea level is rising, its temperature is going up, and the little alluvial spit that this village used to be, that is on, used to be protected from spring and fall storms by ice that built up along the shore. And so when the storms came, any worry of erosion was not a problem. But the sea doesn't freeze like it did, and there isn't ice. And so the sea ravages the shore. And what they do with the whale meat, which they only hunt in the spring, is they had natural freezers dug into the permafrost. And this is Carolyn's husband, Noah, and he's actually down a ladder into what is a deep freeze, a natural deep freeze. But two things are happening there. The permafrost is leaching out of the ground, and so their whale meat is starting to ferment, and it's not being kept cool for the whole time they're there. And in fact, there had just been, before we arrived, a vicious storm that had actually ripped out 2 or 3 of these deep freezes along the shore. It was actually very difficult to look at. That's whale meat, preserved whale meat that's come out of there. That's only like 2 weeks old. But the cold is going out of the ground as a result of a changing climate. But I think what surprised me, although Noah and others had sort of tears in their eyes as they're talking about what's going on, they had this kind of we'll figure it out attitude. And then I don't know if you noticed in the last little while, Point Hope, Tikarak was in the news because Quintillion Networks, who are involved in subsea fiber optic cables, they're linking London with Tokyo, they needed a place to put a node in their network, and guess who was courting them? This is not seismic testing, which is messing with the whales. This is a very different, they knew about the sort of the consequences of this technology, but they also knew that if they had a big, fat fiber optic cable, that would link their children with what really matters in the world to give them a leg up so they could still hunt whale and still participate in the world economy. Amazing, absolutely amazing. This is an amalgamation story. James Gosnell is actually no longer alive, but it's in the Nass River Valley. This is an amazing Canadian story, and if you don't know about it, it's a totally inspiring story. The Canadian Indian Act separates 4 Nisga'a communities up the Nass River from Kincolith to, well, you can see them on the map, and I'm not going to butcher the nuances at the top, but those 4 communities, since the creation of the Indian Act, have been dealt with separately by the federal government, but they're all Nisga'a people. They're all Nisga'a speakers. They all feed from the same river. And what James Gosnell did is he was among those, took them over a century to get out from under the Indian Act and bring those 4 communities back together as one whole unit. And if you go to those communities, one of the deals of their deal with the feds, and it's unique in the country, is that they would be attached to the road to Terrace with a road, and they call it Highway 113 because that's the number of years it took to negotiate the deal. And if you're sitting there worried about the deal that you're negotiating, there's a story here about persistence. There's a story here about vision. There's a story here about community leadership, because in any First Nation community, there are always people who say, I'd rather stick with the treaty rights I know and just get the feds to live up to them than give that away for something that is yet to be born. But the leaders in that community were able to convince people, and it is, I tell you, when this little kid, Logan Moore, started singing his little heart out at one of the events we were at, there was freedom and possibility in that kid that I have never witnessed in my life before. And that was so, so exciting. Another story, another place, another hero, Gu Zhao. Gu Zhao is an amazing guy. You've seen him on the news, I know for sure. So what were the Queen Charlotte Islands out to the west are the home of the Haida. And Gu Zhao, Gary Edenshaw is his name, but Gu Zhao is his proper name, was one of the spark plugs who led the charge to assert Haida presence in those islands. And an amazing story, you may know that Guayhanas is the federal park, the national park at the south end of what used to be South Moresby Island. But these 2 guys, the guy at the top is Ernie Gladstone, who's part Haida, but he's like the federal representative of the park, and there's Gu Zhao. But those 2 guys sat down and said, you know, this thing, we never call it a park, but this protected area at the bottom of these islands is based on a disagreement. We said, well, what's that about? And they said, well, we think, the Haida think they own it, the feds think they own it, but rather than sit there and stare at each other over the table and bicker over it day after day after day after day, they said, let's just get beyond that and start managing it as if it was a resource that mattered to both of us. And that's what they're doing. But the story I want to just tell you from here, and I'm relating this because it was as if the Stanley Cup had come to Skidegate. They too were sick and tired of being called, this was Haida Gwaii, these 2 islands. That's the name of it from a Haida perspective. And of course, on a map, they are the Queen Charlotte Islands. So they had a huge ceremony not too terribly long ago. And what they did is they got a little piece of paper, and you may want to try this at home if you've got something that would work. They wrote Queen Charlotte Islands on the paper They put it in a beautiful bentwood box made just for this. And they gave it to Premier Gordon Campbell. And they said, here, you can have your name back. From now on, this is Haida Gwaii. And there's a movie about that. And honestly, the roar that went up in that room when that box, when that little piece of paper with Queen Charlotte, when it was handed over, you would have thought they'd won the Stanley Cup. It was an amazing, amazing event. How simple, how inspired. Man, we're moving along. I want to thank Mayor Lisa Helps in Victoria for something, because I have some empirical research here I want to share with you for the first time. Nobody has ever seen this, because this is empirical evidence that rural life matters. So Lisa Helps, the mayor, she's very articulate. She welcomed us to Victoria in the ship, but she tasked the Victoria Fire Department with welcoming us. And like Toronto, they had a two-spigot fireboat that brought the Polar Prince into Victoria Harbor. And it was absolutely fantastic. The community came out, and although we had people from Victoria on the ship at various times on the 150 days, we didn't have anybody from Victoria on the ship as we rolled into town, but we had welcomed some people on who got on just the day before. But it was really, it was such a magnanimous gesture for the mayor to pull out all the stops and welcome us to town. And it really made me think that this was something that mattered. We'd had this 150-day conversation about the future of Canada, and that was very, very cool. But that took me back instantly, and I want to just tip my hat here. I grew up in Guelph, but I live in Sealy's Bay, Ontario, which is leads in the Thousand Islands, and I know our mayor is here. And I'm proudly from there, because what happened in Victoria, thanks to the mayor, it took me back to our own little community. But mostly what it did was take me back to June 3rd, 2012. You may remember that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, that was the 60th anniversary of her reign. And an amazing day it was. And for reasons that still completely elude my mother, she went to her grave thinking I was the wrong guy to do this, because I kind of developed something of a Republican spirit growing up in Canada. I wasn't as deferential to Her Majesty as perhaps I should have been. But for whatever reason, I became captain of Canada I, the only Canadian vessel on the Thames that day in London. And I didn't really realize how big a deal this was until we fixed up the canoe that was going to go there at our house in Sealy's Bay before we shipped it to the UK. It's the most amazing portage in a C-130 jet-powered. There are only two things on the transport plane. There was a huge portrait of Her Majesty and my canoe. And I actually got to ride it like Slim Pickens in, remember, Failsafe for Dr. Strangelove, I think it was. But here's the metric that I want to show you, and I want to just show you the heart of a little community, because it's really where Canada, where the province resides. I mean, I can't begin to tell you what the sound was like of 17 million people lining the river, and you know, to paddle by the Queen and hear her say, and to have Philip reply. But for reasons that I'll explain in a second, our community of Sealy's Bay said, look, if you're going to the Thames to represent Canada, you need to practice so that you don't screw up when you're there. And so I said, sure, that sounds good. Well, that happened sort of at 2 o'clock one day for a practice at 3 o'clock the next day. About 5 o'clock that first day, Ron Charles from the National called and said, we're bringing a team from the National down to photograph and make a news story about this. And I said, how did you hear about this? And he said, oh, somebody called. And I thought, oh, okay. So they showed up. Well, I learned some things about this. The news item was 47 seconds long, and at about the 49-second mark, I started getting hate mail from people who said, you're the son of a surgeon lieutenant in the British Navy. You should not be putting up an international distress signal on the national news. So it turns out there's a right way and a wrong way. You see the wide stripe up at the top of the mast there is below, it's sort of underneath the red stripe. That's an international distress signal. Yeah, the right way is this way. You may not have known that. That's a takeaway from here next time the Queen shows up in your community, but that's not what I really wanted to tell you about. Our amazing volunteer fire department got it in their heads that there was going to be a fireboat of some kind on the Thames, and we needed to acclimatize ourselves to that kind of splendor. And so they had a one-lunger pump that they used for fighting fires, and they borrowed somebody's boat. And indeed, we had a one-spigot fireboat there, and we paddled like crazy. And indeed, when we got to the Thames, by golly, there was a fireboat, the mother of all fireboats. But here's what I want to tell you. Sealy's Bay, Ontario, population 800. One spigot. Okay? Stick with me here. London, England, 8 million people, 8 spigots. 1 million people per spigot. So I'm here to tell you that living in Sealy's Bay, Ontario is 1,250 times better than living in London, England. And I know you're saying, look, Jimmy, what about the math on the yeah, okay, Victoria, I know some of you are sitting there. So 84.5 thousand people, 2 spigots, 42 point. So living in rural Ontario is 52 times better than Victoria. By the way, Kat, I don't know if you noticed on those municipal things, it said distance from VU. Yeah, that was the vortex of the universe. That's Toronto, right? But Kat, you said that this was the big smoke. And from now on, if I ever tell this story again, I'm going to go distance from BS.
It could be Ottawa, but I'll slip Toronto.
Yeah, okay. And here, I know you've been waiting for this. We need a bit of a drum roll. Could we have a drum roll? Yeah, okay. How much better is it living in rural Ontario than in Toronto? Yeah, well, okay, 2.5 million for fire, that's, yeah. Living in rural Ontario is 870 times better than living in the vortex of the universe, yeah. Okay, if you're from Toronto, I'm not here to insult you. Well, yes, I am. What I wanted to say is that the 10th hero is you. And for me, the you in this category is my friend and counselor, Liz Huff, who probably called the National and has done a whole lot of other stuff. But you're a Liz Huff, and you're a community organizer, and a lot of what you do goes without saying. It goes, in fact, actively with saying that is contrary to what you want to do. And I'm here to tell you that in this nation of rivers, in this river of nations, in this province of possibility, where, you know, the economic heart is maybe in the Golden Horseshoe, but the community soul of this province is in the hinterland. And, I mean, you need both. You absolutely need both. You need urbanity and you need rurality to come together to make a whole. But so often there's a kind of a valence to being a big city operative and a kind of a negative valence to being a small town bumpkin. And as a proud small town bumpkin, I want to tell you that no matter where I go on the edges of the earth, quite often, there is no substitute for heart. There is no substitute for vision It doesn't matter how fancy you are. You don't need a big budget to believe that something is possible. And that's what I see is happening with Roma. And that's what I see is happening in the hinterland of the country. And I just want to finish by playing you a tune. This is a kind of a bigger story, but there are a lot of people for whom this country has not been a great fit, especially in last year in this sesquicentennial year. And I've been kind of actively looking for songs that might somehow better reflect who we are as a nation. And there were a lot of songs written on the Polar Prince, but none better than one called River of Nations, Nation of Rivers, that was written on leg 2 by Heather Rankin from the Rankin family, Andrea Menard, Alex Cuba, my roommate, and they had just listened to me riffing on about the bark canoe in there and how we are a nation of rivers, nation of canoes, and that we need to pull together and that we share the waterway, that vessel stands for all of that. And they wrote this song on a school bus coming back with attitudinous Dio horn from Ganawage back to the ship. And we sang it and we recorded it, but what they did at the end of this journey is they recut the song. So what you're actually going to do in the song is you're actually going to travel the 10 stops that you've just had in this song. And I want to leave it with you as a way of saying, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Godspeed and good luck in your deliberations, and carry on doing what you're doing, because the world is a better place because of that. Here is a tune right out of the box called River of Nations, Nation of Rivers.
I hope you're ready to be taken on a journey and to be inspired by our opening keynote speaker, Dr. James Rothman. A childhood immersed in nature, studies in biology, working as a canoe guide, and head of the Outdoor and Experiential Education Unit at Queen's University, all eventually led him to his current journey as author and adventurer. James's life centers on organizing and participating in a variety of annual expeditions related to his writing and research interests. Last summer, he was part of the Connected by Canoe project, a canoe journey marking Canada's 150th, with a floating forum to connect Canadians to each other and to the natural world. Last month, he was honored by the Governor-General with a Meritorious Service Medal for his leadership at the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough. James is a prolific writer. You might know his work as an author of many best-selling books, such as Rendezvous with the Wild, Fire in the Bones, or Emperor of the North. Or you might have seen one of his contributions to National Geographic, the Globe and Mail, CBC Radio, or the Discovery Channel. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dr. James Rothman.
Good morning, friends, Romans. Roma ends. Countrymen, I've got a snoot full of Shakespeare. We went to see King Lear last night. King Lear's a woman now. Anyway, I'm just going to start in and say thank you for the introduction, Liz. I do indeed want to take you on a journey this morning, and that journey is going to take you around Canada. I think the defining characteristic of this nation is that it is a nation of rivers. And it is also a river of nations. And I want to honor Kat Krieger and say thank you for bringing a Cayuga voice and to get us started right here. But if there is a jewel in the center of this nation with respect to its riparian heritage, it's got to be this amazing province of Ontario. And I think too often, most of us get sort of caught up in the idea that the golden horseshoe is the Ontario that matters. And indeed, it probably, in some senses, in terms of industry, is the economic